December 2nd, 2022. The state of Georgia. Liberty County stretches across a landscape cut by narrow rivers and dense patches of woodland that fall nearly silent in the winter months. On that day, a group of local hunters pushed through thick underbrush a couple of miles off the nearest highway and came across something that didn't belong there. Scattered among the leaves were fragments of a human body. Crime scene specialists who arrived at the location determined the remains belonged to a woman. The perpetrator had acted with calculated precision. The body had been dismembered, the parts dispersed several yards apart. There were no documents, no cell phone, no personal belongings, nothing that could help establish her identity. She was dressed in plain athletic pants and a basic t-shirt, the kind sold in any major retail chain across the United States. A visual examination revealed no tattoos, scars, or piercings. The only lead investigators had was a modern dental implant. Its serial number offered a slim chance of identification through dental records. According to preliminary findings from the medical examiner, she had passed away in late November, just days before the discovery. But a search through missing persons databases across Georgia and neighboring states turned up nothing. The Liberty County Sheriff's Office released a detailed facial reconstruction based on the anatomical features of the skull. The image, a woman with balanced features and light-colored hair, was broadcast across local media. At that point, investigators had no idea that the person they were trying to identify was not officially listed among the living, and that her disappearance had been concealed behind a trail of carefully fabricated emails. While detectives in Georgia worked to put a name to the remains, hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania, a woman named Heather turned on her television and saw a face she recognized, one that, according to the story she had been told, had already been laid to rest months earlier. Heather contacted the Liberty County Sheriff's Department a few days after the composite sketch aired. She claimed the woman was Mindy Cassodus, the wife of her former husband Nicholas. That statement directly conflicted with what friends and family had been told. According to Nicholas, 40-year-old Mindy had passed away in late November 2022 at a medical facility in Savannah due to sudden health complications. During questioning, it became clear Heather's connection to the family went beyond familiarity. It was tied to a long-standing legal dispute. After their divorce in 2015, Nicholas Cassodus owed Heather approximately $1.5 million. Instead of complying with the court's ruling, he had effectively vanished, cutting off communication and concealing his whereabouts. Law enforcement had already issued a warrant for his arrest, related to unpaid support obligations and violations of the divorce agreement. Detectives began checking hospitals across Georgia and neighboring states, searching for any record of Mindy Cassodus being admitted or pronounced deceased. The result? Absolute silence. Not a single hospital in the region had treated a patient by that name during the specified time frame, and no official death certificate existed anywhere in the system. Mindy hadn't died from a sudden illness. Instead, she had simply ceased to exist in official records at the exact moment Nicholas began telling others about her supposed passing. At the same time, investigators uncovered an even stranger detail that deepened the mystery. Mutual acquaintances of the couple were thoroughly convinced that Nicholas himself was also dead. In late 2022, his parents and close friends had received messages claiming he had been involved in a fatal car crash. The story of a double tragedy in the Cassodus family seemed complete, if not for the glaring absence of any police reports confirming such a devastating accident ever occurred. Detectives began to suspect that this elaborate chain of reported deaths was nothing more than a calculated strategy to sever ties with his past and evade a multi-million-dollar debt. To definitively confirm the identity of the woman found in the woods, police reached out to Mindy Cassodus's parents. It turned out they hadn't seen their daughter in several years, yet they had been receiving regular emails from her. In her most recent messages, she described suffering from serious health issues and facing ongoing hospitalization. The parents had even received emails supposedly sent by medical staff detailing a steady, heartbreaking decline in her condition. Their belief in Mindy's natural passing was so absolute that they never initiated a missing persons search. fully accepting the inability to hold a proper funeral due to unspecified bureaucratic complications Nicholas had carefully explained to them. Investigators collected DNA samples from Mindy's parents for forensic analysis. While the biological material was being processed, digital forensic analysts began tracking Nicholas's online footprint. What they discovered was deeply unsettling. The man everyone believed had perished in a fiery crash was still actively using banking services and moving across state lines. Before long, that digital trail led detectives straight to Pennsylvania. There, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, lived a man whose physical characteristics perfectly matched Nicholas Cassodus, yet he was operating under a completely different name, Nicholas Killian James Stark. By the time authorities in Georgia pinpointed his location, Stark had already fully integrated into the local community. He lived the quiet life of a law-abiding citizen, was married for the third time, and was comfortably settling into a home with his new spouse, who genuinely believed she had married a single man with an entirely clean past. For law enforcement, the conclusion was undeniably clear. Nicholas hadn't just disappeared into thin air. He had methodically dismantled his former identity, leaving behind in the silent forests of Georgia everything that connected him to his previous life. In May 2023, a specialized task force arrived in York County, Pennsylvania. A quiet suburban street in the town of Dover became the final stop in a months-long digital manhunt. Nicholas Killian James Stark, as he now called himself, was living in a comfortable private home, a daily life that stood in stark contrast to the instability and constant movement he had maintained in the years leading up to Mindy's disappearance. On May 13th, officers surrounded the property and moved in to make the arrest. For Stark, or Cassodus, it came as a complete shock. A man who had spent months building vast distance between himself and his past suddenly found himself face-to-face with an active arrest warrant. During a thorough search of the residence, investigators uncovered undeniable evidence confirming his true identity. Among his new family's belongings lay documents bearing the name Nicholas Cassodus, side by side with electronic devices used to orchestrate his deceptive web, sending messages while posing as medical staff and official representatives. Nicholas's new wife was plunged into a state of utter shock. She had met him during a period when, according to his own believable story, he was already a grieving widower. Nicholas had presented himself as a man who had endured a truly devastating loss, claiming that his late wife, Mindy, had passed away from a severe illness. They had been eagerly planning a future together, building a family, and settling down for the long term in Pennsylvania. A writer by profession, she had no idea that her husband was a wanted fugitive, that his so-called mourning was merely part of an elaborate narrative, and that his previous wife was still very much alive at the exact moment he began pursuing her. The official identification of the remains discovered in the Georgia woods was finalized on May 12th, just one day prior to his arrest. Results from the genetic analysis perfectly matched the DNA samples provided by Mindy Cassodus's parents, granting detectives undeniable proof. The remains unearthed in Liberty County were not those of an unknown individual, but of the very woman whose death Nicholas had staged for her family months earlier. From that pivotal moment on, Cassodus's status shifted drastically from someone wanted for unpaid legal obligations to the primary suspect in a first-degree crime. Inside the interrogation room, Nicholas Stark continued to cling stubbornly to his chosen narrative. He didn't deny being in Georgia, but the story he offered sounded more like the plot of a Hollywood spy novel than reality. He claimed that Mindy had indeed passed away in a hospital and that her subsequent disappearance had been orchestrated directly by the FBI as part of a witness protection program. According to his tale, they had been targeted by a dangerous terrorist group, forcing him to alter his identity and go deep into hiding. Stark's version of events relied heavily on the existence of an external threat, an unseen enemy he suggested was ultimately responsible for what happened to Mindy. However, as detectives examined his current life in Pennsylvania, they uncovered a telling detail that dismantled his illusion. The name Stark wasn't chosen at random. It was a direct reference to Tony Stark, the famous comic book character. Nicholas had crafted an image of himself as a heroic figure in the eyes of his new wife, surrounding his story with an aura of danger and mystery that conveniently explained his secrecy and the total absence of any verifiable past. While Nicholas tried to convince investigators that he was caught up in a grand conspiracy, forensic analysts began unraveling his actual financial trail. Inside the Dover home, authorities discovered bank cards issued under false identities, along with comprehensive lists of passwords. It became glaringly clear that behind the facade of a stable marriage was a man who, within mere months of Mindy's disappearance, had not only reappeared in a new state, but had also entered into a legal marriage using a completely fabricated background. Every single detail of his new life had been carefully calibrated to permanently bury the truth about what had transpired in the forests of Georgia in late November of the previous year. To fully comprehend how Nicholas Cassodus arrived at creating the false identity of Stark, investigators had to meticulously reconstruct his past. The story of his downfall had begun long before the horrific discovery in the Georgia woods. Nicholas was by no means an ordinary fraudster. He possessed an elite education and an impressive professional background, credentials that had served for years as his perfect cover. A graduate of a prestigious law school, Nicholas Cassodus had built a distinguished career within the United States Navy, serving as an officer in the JAG Corps, the military's legal branch. It was a high-profile role that demanded not only a deep knowledge of the law, but also high-level access to sensitive information. His assignments had taken him to critical locations worldwide, ranging from offices inside the Pentagon to military bases in Italy and Iraq. To colleagues and the public alike, Nicholas appeared to be the absolute model officer, disciplined, intelligent, and deeply committed to upholding the law. That spotless reputation would later allow him to manipulate and mislead people who were naturally conditioned to trust the authority of a uniform. In 2015, during a bitter divorce from Heather, Cassodus's life began to split into two drastically different realities. While courtrooms handled intense disputes over property division and multi-million-dollar financial settlements, Nicholas quietly signed up for an online dating site. That was where he met Mindy Mabry. She was a confident, independent woman from North Carolina who, by the age of 40, had already established herself as a successful podcast creator and entrepreneur. Mindy was instantly drawn to Nicholas's impressive military background, while he, in turn, carefully cultivated an image of someone closely connected to high-level government work. By 2016, the two were officially married. At first, their life together looked like a textbook version of the American dream, marked by a strong income, social recognition, and mutual support. Mindy expanded her media ventures, while Nicholas continued working as an attorney, leveraging his strategic connections within defense-related circles. But behind that polished exterior, serious financial cracks were already forming. Cassodus began actively exploiting both his professional position and the trust of those around him to execute a series of concealed schemes. A major turning point in Nicholas's dark transformation was his absolute refusal to accept failure. Instead of addressing the massive financial obligations he owed to his former spouse, he began constructing an elaborate web of deception centered around Mindy. His legal expertise and familiarity with military intelligence operations allowed him to craft a frighteningly convincing narrative about a supposed top-secret danger facing their family. Gradually and deliberately, he convinced her that their past life had to be entirely erased for their own safety. Investigators later determined that Nicholas skillfully used real details from his military service to lend absolute credibility to these fabricated threats. When he spoke about dangerous enemies of the state, Mindy believed every word. After all, she knew about his time connected to the Pentagon and his high-stakes work in Iraq. What had begun as a respected legal career slowly evolved into something else entirely. Nicholas had effectively become the director of his own criminal narrative. By the time they abandoned their permanent home, he had gained near total control over how Mindy perceived reality, setting the stage for their final and ultimately tragic move to Georgia. By 2020, Nicholas Cassodus's financial situation had reached a critical breaking point. In addition to the $1.5 million he owed his former wife, shocking new details about his professional misconduct began to surface. An internal military review revealed that Nicholas had been systematically stealing funds from his own colleagues in the U.S. Navy. Using privileged access to their sensitive personal information, he opened fraudulent credit cards and carried out illegal banking activities, ultimately misappropriating approximately $180,000. To conceal these blatant crimes from Mindy and explain away the sudden, drastic shift in their lifestyle, Nicholas constructed a large-scale illusion. He convinced his wife that his legal work for the military had made them direct targets of an international terrorist cell. According to his dramatic story, these enemies of the state had gained full control over all their financial assets, making the use of personal bank accounts and credit cards extremely dangerous. From that moment on, their lives turned into a constant, paranoid escape, leaving Mindy Cassodus in a state of complete isolation. Nicholas insisted they abandon their permanent home and begin a life on the run, moving endlessly between hotels and short-term rentals booked through platforms like Airbnb. He seized complete control of all communication. Mindy was strictly forbidden from using a smartphone equipped with GPS tracking, and any contact with the outside world was restricted to secure laptops configured solely by Nicholas. In her eyes, her husband was a heroic protector, someone standing alone against an invisible, lethal threat to keep them safe. During the investigation, authorities uncovered emails Mindy had sent to close friends in 2021. In those messages, she described her daily existence as a real-life spy thriller, genuinely believing that agents were monitoring their every move and that Nicholas was receiving classified instructions directly from superiors in Washington. A woman who had once been a thriving, independent entrepreneur was now spending her days confined to dreary motel rooms, waiting patiently for her husband to signal their next move. To maintain this oppressive atmosphere, Nicholas relied heavily on his understanding of intelligence tactics. He instructed Mindy to alter her physical appearance, adopt aliases when checking into hotels, and pay exclusively in cash. Money, he claimed, came from secure government sources. In reality, these funds were the remaining proceeds stolen from his military colleagues, combined with money he managed to extort from acquaintances under the guise of urgent investment opportunities. The paranoia Nicholas meticulously cultivated in Mindy became his most powerful tool of psychological control. She never questioned their dwindling finances because she believed their accounts had been frozen by hostile forces. She never reached out to law enforcement because she was convinced that government agencies had been thoroughly infiltrated by those same enemies. Cassodus had engineered a closed, impenetrable world for his wife, one where he served as her sole source of truth and her only savior. By the fall of 2022, however, that fragile illusion began to crumble. Their stolen funds were running dangerously low, and the elaborate lie regarding external threats required constant, exhausting reinforcement. Mindy began showing growing signs of concern, eventually suggesting they either seek official help from federal authorities or find a realistic way to return to a normal life. For Nicholas, whose actual reality consisted of active arrest warrants and overwhelming million-dollar debts, a return to normalcy meant facing a lifetime in prison. It was during this tense period that the couple relocated to Georgia, renting a home in Savannah that would ultimately become the final stop in this prolonged cycle of fear and psychological captivity. By mid-May 2023, investigators had finalized an exhaustive analysis of Nicholas Cassodus's digital footprint during the critical final days of November 2022. Detectives successfully reconstructed transaction records from one of Nicholas's hidden bank cards, a card he had recklessly failed to destroy. Combined with precise GPS data extracted from his truck, this evidence allowed law enforcement to trace his movements minute by minute during the exact window when Mindy permanently went silent. On November 23, 2022, just 1 week before her remains were stumbled upon by local hunters, Nicholas Cassodus visited a Home Depot store. Surveillance cameras captured his vehicle entering the parking lot, while interior security footage showed Nicholas himself, calmly browsing the tool department. In the recording, a man wearing a baseball cap and a dark jacket moves through the aisles without drawing a second glance. According to the store receipt, he purchased a heavy-duty hunting knife with a distinctive bright orange handle, protective coveralls, and a specialized set of saws designed to cut through dense materials, including bone. Investigators later matched these chilling purchases directly with the forensic findings from the remains in Liberty County. The pattern of markings on the bones indicated the use of fine-toothed tools capable of producing clean, precise cuts. Forensic specialists confirmed that the type of saws found in the kit Cassodus purchased matched those exact characteristics. In addition, microscopic particles of orange plastic were recovered at the recovery site, with laboratory analysis proving the material was chemically consistent with the handle of the knife sold at Home Depot. Cell phone location data from November 24th and 25th ultimately dismantled Nicholas's fabricated claims about a hospital stay and federal agents. During those nights, his device was nowhere near Savannah, where he insisted he was staying by his wife's side. Instead, it was logged deep within a wooded area of Liberty County, pinging at the exact location where hunters would later discover the remains. The duration of the signal, lasting more than 4 hours, suggested the perpetrator spent significant time attempting to conceal the evidence. Another critical element came from the analysis of Nicholas's internet activity. Investigators recovered chilling search queries from his laptop entered just days before his trip to the woods. How fast does a body decompose in swampy soil? Effectiveness of dismemberment for concealing identity, and dental implant database. The man who presented himself as a protective husband and decorated officer had been methodically researching ways to eliminate evidence, drawing directly on his familiarity with legal and forensic systems. During a search of Nicholas's truck, which he had driven all the way to Pennsylvania, investigators sprayed luminol. Despite a thorough cleaning of the interior and cargo area, the chemical revealed extensive traces of blood, which DNA testing confirmed belonged to Mindy Cassodus. It became undeniable that the vehicle had been used to transport her body from the rented home in Savannah to the remote wooded site. This overwhelming body of evidence, surveillance footage of the purchases, GPS tracking, browser history, and biological traces inside the vehicle, formed an airtight chain. Every move Nicholas Cassodus made in late November was documented through precise digital and physical proof. While he continued spinning stories to detectives about imaginary terrorists, investigators already held a detailed, minute-by-minute account of the tools he used and the exact window of time when he attempted to dispose of the evidence under the cover of darkness in the forests of Georgia. After the evidence from the Home Depot purchase and the forensic analysis was formally presented, Nicholas Cassodus found himself trapped with nowhere left to turn. Prosecutors in the state of Georgia built their case around what they described as a calculated, deliberate planning of the crime. The fact that the tools used to dismember the body had been purchased in advance allowed the prosecution to classify the act as a first-degree crime with aggravating factors. The trial began in 2024 and quickly captured national media attention. Ever the former military attorney, Nicholas attempted to use his legal expertise to slow down the proceedings. He repeatedly changed defense lawyers and filed numerous motions to exclude the critical GPS data from the case, arguing that it violated his constitutional rights. However, the judge denied those motions, ruling that the digital evidence had been lawfully obtained and was fully admissible. A pivotal, heart-wrenching moment in the trial arrived, with the emotional testimony from Mindy's parents. They described how, for months after their daughter's actual death, they continued receiving messages sent in her name. Technical analysis confirmed that those emails originated from IP addresses tied directly to hotels where Nicholas had been staying at the time. Mindy's parents emphasized that the illusion of her continued life was so convincing that they even transferred money for what they believed was her expensive medical treatment, funds that Nicholas ultimately kept for himself. The prosecution presented the jury with a meticulously reconstructed timeline of Mindy's final hours. According to the case file, the fatal events took place inside the rented home in Savannah, after which her body was moved into the bed of his truck. The prosecutor displayed surveillance footage from Home Depot alongside devastating images from the recovery site in the woods. The precision with which Cassodus carried out each step was interpreted by the jury as clear evidence that he was fully aware and in complete control of his actions throughout the entire crime. During closing arguments, Nicholas abruptly changed his strategy. He abandoned his grand narrative about international terrorists and attempted to claim he had acted in a state of sudden emotional distress, allegedly triggered by his wife's aggressive behavior. However, the total absence of any signs of struggle on his body at the time of his arrest, combined with the fact that he had previously purchased specialized dismemberment tools, completely undermined that argument. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty. Nicholas Cassodus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court also ordered him to pay $1.5 million in compensation to Heather and to repay the money taken from his fellow service members. In reality, those financial payments remained largely symbolic. His assets had already been entirely spent on maintaining his fabricated lifestyle in Pennsylvania and covering his mounting legal expenses. The Cassodus case became a landmark example in the power of digital forensics. It demonstrated that even a trained attorney and military officer, someone who understood the legal system from the inside, could not completely erase his digital footprint. A single overlooked bank card, along with microscopic traces of orange plastic left behind in the silent forests of Georgia, ultimately brought an end to the story of a man who had spent years successfully fabricating identities and rewriting his own reality. While the sentence handed down to Nicholas Cassodus brought legal closure to the case, it left one critical question unanswered: the fate of the stolen assets. A financial crimes task force conducted a final audit of every account connected to the convicted man. Investigators determined that over the years, more than $2 million had passed through Nicholas's hands. Yet by the time of his arrest in Dover, the balances on all accessible accounts were nearly zero. The money he had taken from Mindy, her grieving parents, and his former Navy colleagues had effectively vanished, spent on upscale rentals, expensive disguises, and maintaining the image of a successful man for his third wife. For Mindy's family and his former spouse, Heather, the court's order of multi-million-dollar compensation became little more than a paper formality. Official inquiries to banks in Pennsylvania and Georgia confirmed that Cassodus owned no real estate or significant assets. Everything, down to the house in Dover, had been placed under false identities or tied up in temporary lease agreements. The story of Nicholas Stark Cassodus came to an end behind the severe walls of a maximum security prison. A former elite legal officer, he now occupied a place among those he once helped put behind bars, leaving behind nothing but overwhelming debt and the shattered remnants of lives he had irreversibly destroyed.